I don't know if this is just a me thing, but I never really was able to picture a Megaman game as an RPG. Sure, we got the Battle Network games in the early 2000s, but it's a different type of RPG than what was normal back in the 90s and early 2000s. You know, things like turn-based battles and strategy, with the juggernauts of the genre being Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest. But you know that didn't stop them from trying to turn Mega Man into an RPG, since they gave us the Mega Man X series, a RPG spin-off called Mega Man X Command Mission. Mega Man X Command Mission is a weird game to talk about when it comes to the Mega Man X sub-series. Most if not all Mega Man games are all 2D platformers. Even the other spin-offs I talked about on the channel like the Extreme Duology and the remake Mega Man Maverick Hunter X. But this game is a turn-based RPG, which is something that makes some logical sense for the series, given it was trying to be more story-focused than the classic series. But it's also something that is out of left field given that X to this point was always a 2D platformer, when the classic series had spin-offs that sometimes differed to other genres like arcade brawlers, racers, and sports games. Now, I need to make this clear. I am a fan of RPGs, with the likes of Xenoblade Chronicles, Sea of Stars, and Final Fantasy VII, and other games of the genre being some of my favorite games ever. Intriguing characters to follow while also having gameplay that keeps me engaged is something I never get tired of. This will be an interesting review to say the least, because of one little thing I mentioned here and there in previous videos on my Mega Mans. I have never played Mega Man X Command Mission. It is the only Mega Man X game I haven't played up to this point. I bought a PS2 copy at Too Many Games 2024, but never really had the chance to play it or even emulate it on Dolphin for the hell of it. But today, we changed that. For this video, I played the entire game from beginning to end. Just to let you all know, I will probably miss a few things about this game, so be aware of that. I know that there's some extra forms and there's a secret boss, but honestly, I wasn't all that interested to get through that, so just be warned. We will be looking into Mega Man's first jump into the RPG genre and see how the team handle it, and if it nails being a fun game. With all of that out of the way, let's get started. The setup for Mega Man X Command Mission is that X-Zero and a newcomer to the Maverick Hunter team named Shadow have been deployed to an area of Giga City where an asteroid made contact. The reason why this asteroid is so important is that the asteroids in this universe contain an alloy. This alloy was called Force Metal, which increased the power and intellect of Reploids. The development of Force Metals led to the creation of Giga City, which are a set of man-made islands in the middle of the ocean. Right as the mission begins, X is cut off from Zero and Shadow, where they will meet up at the top of the tower. During your trek up the tower, you look into pods that seem to have been destroyed and or opened, where the Rebellion Armory leader Epsilon and his lackeys seem to be held. On the roof, X and Zero find Shadow facing Epsilon. They move to arrest Epsilon, but Shadow turns on them.
Shadow? No way!
Shadow is a believer. He understands our goals. I'll ask again, whose side are you on?
We then meet some of Epsilon's right-hand men, as I like to call them, Scarface, Bodos, and Ferrum. X and Zero realize they've been led into an ambush. Zero rushes Epsilon, but is sent flying off the ruins by the team's attacks. Now alone, X has no choice but to leap into a chasm below. Epsilon stops Ferrum from giving chase, aware that X will return. X awakens in a base called New Hope. A Reploid examines that it's a hideout for the Resistance, a small movement fighting the Rebellion Army's control of Giga City. X learns that the Resistance leader, Chief R, is a hostage in the central tower. X contacts Colonel Redlips to inform him of Shadow's betrayal, but the transmission cuts off before he can receive instructions, so he decides to free Chief R. On his way to Central Tower, X is approached by a rowdy Reploid who reported him to the Rebellion. However, the Reploid is suddenly destroyed.
Huh? Who are you? Trust me, I didn't do that for you.
This is Spider. He is a bounty hunter who plans to turn X over to the rebellion. After a scuffle, alarms go off, so X and Spider flee in different directions. X enters Central Tower and meets Ale, a member of the Resistance. Ale gives X his ID to allow entry to Chief R and the Governor's precinct. Rebellion guards arrive, and Ale self-destructs to let X escape. Meanwhile, the Rebellion boss in Central Tower, Wild Django, discusses payment with Spider for X's defeat. Spider then ambushes X, knocking Ale's ID loose. After listening to X explain Ale's sacrifice, Spider is touched and decides to help instead, moving to keep guards busy. X uses this chance to free Chief R. However, Wild Django contacts Chief R and X, showing he has beaten Spider and set a time bomb in Central Tower. X rushes to the command center to defuse the bomb, then heads for the helipad to stop Django's escape. X is overpowered by Django, but the wounded Spider arrives as backup. Together, X and Spider destroy Django, freeing Central Tower from the rebellion. Spider explains that he is an old friend of Ale's, and that he couldn't help but aid the resistance upon learning his friend gave his life for it. So now it's you and Spider's job to get back Zero and build an army to stop the rebellion army from ruling the world or something. One of the things I really like about this setup is that there is no implication that Sigma is the villain in this game, which was a smart decision. Sigma by around X3 or X4 started to really lose his luster as an antagonist, leading to Mega Man X6 and X7 where they were his worst appearance in the series by this point, since it was predictable. So going for a new set of villains was something that I give the team props on. How they were handled is something we can speak on when we get to the story part of the video. Now, I think one thing we need to talk about first is the overall presentation of the game. I think it is safe to say that Mega Man X7 didn't really paint a pretty picture for how the X series can look on the next generation of consoles at the time. But good news everyone, I do think that Command Mission is an improvement over X7, but is far from meeting the standards of games from the same generation or even games from that same year. Now before we get into any of that, I need to mention that this game was released on 2 consoles. Mega Man games at this time were primarily released on PlayStation consoles. Mega Man 8, Mega Man X4, X5, X6, and X7 to name a few, as well as some other titles like the Japanese-only Super Rockman Adventure and Mega Man Battle & Chase were only released on PlayStation consoles. But for this game, there was not only a PS2 release, but also a GameCube release, which was super out of left field at the time, since no X game was on Nintendo consoles since 1995 with Mega Man X3, and even after it released, X8 didn't come out on GameCube, and the only thing the GameCube got from the X series is the first X collection. Now, there are differences between the PS2 version and the GameCube version, but from what I tested of the GameCube release on Dolphin, it's honestly not much to really write home about if you ask me. I mean, there are differences, but they are mostly visual differences. Firstly, the GameCube version runs at 60 FPS, whereas the PS2 version runs at 30 FPS. Now, I know people nowadays are frame rate snobs and want almost all their games to be 60 FPS or 124 FPS, God forbid. But honestly, for turn-based RPGs, it's not even worth it to go 60 FPS if you ask me. The game also looks a lot sharper on the GameCube release, which is a given when working with more powerful hardware. But the real talking point with the differences with the release is that the GameCube version has a higher chance of random encounters than the PS2 version. For the sake of making sure that this video gets out, I only captured the first chapter of the game on GameCube, so I decided to count each random encounter I had in the first chapter. In the GameCube version, I had around 8 random encounters in the first chapter, and in the PS2 version, I had around 10 random encounters. Now, I am not a math major, but I know that the numbers and the hypothesis just don't add up. But yeah, other than those, there really isn't much to write home about in terms of version differences. It's not like Sonic Unleashed on 360 compared to Sonic Unleashed on the Wii. Now, people normally play the GameCube release of the game for the video, but I'm gonna be the weird YouTuber this time and play the PlayStation 2 version for this video, because I honestly don't mind the lower frame rate, and honestly, I prefer playing non-GameCube exclusive games with a PlayStation controller. Now that we got that out of the way, let's actually talk about how the game overall looks and performs. Now, let's talk about the improvements to the way they transitioned the X series to this title. I think that this game looks overall pretty decent. I don't think that this game holds a candle to some of the juggernauts of the PlayStation 2 console, or even other 6th generation titles like Ratchet & Clank, Jak 2, Super Mario Sunshine, or The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. But I think the game looks fine overall. The color palette's a little too dark for my liking, but I think that was the overall point, and there are some areas in this game that I like the visual presentations of. I do think that the anti-aliasing is not as good, with character models looking a little jaggy even on the GameCube release to some extent, but definitely better than how they looked in Mega Man X7. I think the biggest detriment to this game visually, however, is that the game uses stilted animation and dialogue for the cutscenes. The character models never really seem to change in terms of how the faces are used. It's all just one stare they have, like they are rehearsing for the Breaking Bad poster face. The animation when they are moving or doing something as simple as walking or moving an arm is all very unnatural. I guess you could make the argument that they are robots, but other Mega Man media like Mega Man 8 and the spin-off Maverick Hunter X tells me otherwise. It makes me sad since there are moments in this game that try to do more with the story and the story development, but it's all held back by stilted execution. And honestly, the piece of media that the cutscenes remind me of the most with Command Mission is Thomas and Friends Season 13. I wish I was not joking. That's not to say that Command Mission is as bad as Season 13 of Thomas, but I get the same vibes from it. They both have actors that I know are really good at their jobs, but they are held back by circumstances either put on them like the voice direction or out of their control like the animation or script. I think what carries this game visually for me is the art direction that they are going for. They seem to have gone with the shell shaded look for the game, which is something that I'm always down for games having. Games that use this look tend to be games that age better than most other games on their consoles, Wind Waker being the best example. I also like the design of X in this game. He has gold highlights and accents through his body, a bit more black here and there, plus a red hologram scarf that looks really cool. He could get his ass ready for the runway. Now, the last thing that needs to be mentioned about the presentation is the soundtrack of this game, one of my favorite aspects of the X series. Now, in terms of the overworld music, it's stuff I never really paid much attention to, and that might be because of the fact I found that part of the game the least engaging part of the whole package. But on some listens though, going through footage, research, and listening to them on their own, there are some really good songs in here. Just nothing that would rival my favorite songs in the overall series. The battle tracks in this one do their job pretty well though, with getting you in the mood to fight the boss, and I have a few favorites of my own. Now, let's get into the gameplay. There are two things to talk about in terms of gameplay, which are the dungeon exploration and the combat. These two things are typical of what you would expect from an RPG. Just missing traveling via the overworld, but I think I could give it a pass in this game since teleporting to the area feels very in place in the world of the X series. The gameplay is very simple in terms of how you traverse these areas. You just walk and interact with things. There is no run button for X, but instead they bring in the Mega Man X staple of dashing. By pressing the triangle button, now I like the dashing is in this game, but if I were to name the one problem I have with it, it's that there are more end frames when you finish the dash than I personally like. It makes the dash feel like it takes as much time to walk there where you ended up. But I still dashed everywhere I went since I am ADHD brain and I like to see the robot go vroom. Now there are a variety of locations in this game, like a jungle, an underwater prison, and a mine to name a few. But I think the biggest problem I have with them is that most of these locations all look the same through the way they are presented in this game and how they are designed. The presentation isn't as vibrant or as diverse as I think it should be, because they're all just very similar with the robot futuristic look to it, but that's more of a nitpick. My biggest problem is the actual design of the dungeons. They are all so linear. The best example is the dungeon in chapter 8. It's basically just one giant circle just on multiple levels. It makes going through them very confusing. I remember having to open the map more than once in the chapter. Every now and again there are some things to spice up the dungeons, like chapter Chapter 3's dungeon needs you to dash over the red sensors and not have to bring security. Chapter 5's dungeon has the conveyor belt puzzle, and Chapter 7 has the hell escape that is the desert. But these are all things that are just major afterthoughts and never leave much of an impression on the player. One of the complaints I hear the most regarding this game is mostly due with the encounter rate in this game. Random encounters are pretty typical of what you expect from RPGs, especially the turn-based kind, all the way back to ye old Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest. Now, I played the PS2 version of Command Mission, so I don't know if it's just a me thing, but I would either get a million encounters back to back, a few encounters before heading to the new area of the dungeon, or just seem to have no encounters heading into the area of the dungeon. This can be really annoying in this game compared to something like Final Fantasy IV, since Command Mission's typical dungeon exploration design is very linear, but it also relies on backtracking with the Melda ore plant in Chapter 8 being the best example at the end. But I do think it isn't as bad as I thought it was going to be, since you could run away from battles pretty easily in this game, but I would still rather have an encounter rate that is fixed and not as bell curved as it is now. But I overall don't find the design of this game all that engaging to really leave an impact on a player, which is something that is sad to me because you could do so much of a futuristic time period like the X series, and yet here we are. Now for the battle system. The battle system in Command Mission is so similar to Final Fantasy X. So if you played Final Fantasy X, then you basically know how to play Command Mission. You have up to 3 party members in a battle. What dictates when they go is the board that is at the bottom of the screen. This board also shows you when the enemy is going to go. Whenever you choose to do can either keep you where you are on the board, make you move further down the board, or make you further into the board. Sometimes doing an action trigger isn't worth it if you know a dangerous attack is going to happen, so spend that turn healing or defending to get an extra turn later down the line. It's a system that I've grown to love a lot in games like Final Fantasy X and Octopath Traveler. There are not a lot of action in this game. You have your basic attack, but you can do sub-actions alongside your attack. Swell weapons are an X-series staple. There are many types of sub-weapons in this game, like missiles, buffs, actions, etc. They may not pack a punch, but they can definitely help you turn the tides in battle. Each weapon has a cost a certain amount of WE, which is weapon energy. When a character starts a turn, they are given a certain amount of WE. You get a max of 100% of WE when the bar is full. When the bar hits 15% or above, you can use the character's action ability. Action abilities are basically the big mega action that the character can do. Each character's action is different from the others. I will go over each character action when I talk about the characters. Each party member in this game also has their own hyper mode. Hyper modes are transformations for the characters that give them perks that the other characters won't have. Another thing that can affect how your character can function in combat is the mechanic of force medals. Force medals are basically the only way to really give yourself buffs via means of equipment, since there is no armor in this game. There are so many types of force medals that you can equip to your party, like buffs, guards, and there are even force medals that can be only equipped by a certain party member, like X's X Heart. Though you have to be careful with what force medals you equip, because of the erosion meter they have. If you exceed the erosion meter, the character will start having errors that can be things like losing weapon energy every turn. Each character has a certain level of erosion, so some characters can have more powerful ones or won't be able to handle it. Also, there is a limit to how many medals can be equipped to characters. Characters like X and Zero have 3 to 4, while Massimo has 2 medals. And it's highly likely that you're going to use the unique medal, so he will likely only have 1 available slot. After Chapter 4, you are given the Force Metal Generator, or FMG for short. The Force Metal Generator is a crafting system where you have to have certain items or force metals to make new and better force metals for your team. This is a really cool way to get new force metals, but what keeps me from using it for most of the game is that the types of force metals that you make are all tied to Cinnamon's level. That means that when you first get this system, you can't even make most of the force metals that you probably want to get. Also, some of the really powerful force metals require you to give up stat increase items. This leads to it being a double-edged sword where you can craft a really good force metal, but you'll be losing out on a stat upgrade and vice versa. Also, some force metals can be stolen from enemies throughout the game, or just buy the force metals at the shop, since money is not all that hard to rack up in this game. I rarely used the FMG in the game, and I had little to no problems with going through it. Something to also keep in mind is that this game has an element triangle to follow. The 3 elements are fire, water, and thunder. Water beats fire, fire beats thunder, and thunder beats water. I think it's pretty self-explanatory if I say so myself. And finally, there are no healing items in this game. Your healing is going to come from the sub-tanks you have. Some tanks are also an X series staple, and I like the balancing act of juggling when you should use a sub-tank in battle or on the field. Now that's about it in terms of mechanics in the game, so let's get into each character's combat type. Just like in Final Fantasy X, every party member has their own designated role in battles, and I will go over them one by one in order of when you first play them. X is the first party member you play as in this game, and I would overall say that he is an all-around party member, where you can make him whatever you want him to be. Now, I like to play aggressive most of the time when I am given the choice of what I can make my party members be in RPGs, so I made X an attacker in my playthrough, with power-up force medals with a bit of health added to make him take an extra hit or two. His action trigger is his iconic charge shot. The charge shot's power is dictated by how much WE you save up for the action. In his normal form, the charge shot attacks all the enemies on the field. His hyper form is X-Fire. X-Fire makes X's attacks fire elemented by default, no matter what bestiary you have on, boosts his stats, and changes his charge shot. Instead of attacking all the enemies, he attacks one enemy multiple times. And this is an enemy killer, let me tell you. Zero in this game is probably the most powerful character in the game. He is comparable to the warrior class from Final Fantasy. His action trigger is the most fun action trigger in the game if you ask me. It's a time game where you input as many commands as possible. The time is dictated on how much WE you have stored up for the action trigger, and the commands have to be input like fighting game combos. His hyper mode turns him into Black Zero, which is the same color scheme that we see in games like Mega Man X5 and Mega Man X6. It also boosts his stats. Put Zero in hyper mode and get a high number of combos and you have a killing machine. Spider is a kind of jack of all trades guy from what I can gather, which I guess is fitting for who his character is. I really didn't do much with him since he had missiles and the item stole sub weapon. His action trigger is again Balatro. I mean poker, definitely poker, and I definitely don't have a Balacho problem. You are given a set of cards and you choose the ones that you want to reshuffle. The point of this is that you want to try and get the best hand possible. Yeah, no, this is basically playing Balatro in an RPG setting. Help. The WE for this action trigger affects the cards you will get when you shuffle. His hyper mode is called Trickster, and it turns him invisible. When Spider is invisible, he will not receive any damage or status effects, and can be a really helpful hyper mode. Massimo is one of the best looking characters in the game, and he is honestly not a bad tank for what he is. He has his own force medal called Massimo Plus, which gives him a chance to counter enemies who attack him. Massimo also has the highest base health out of all the party members in the game, but of course his speed is low given what role he is, so he isn't going to get much done compared to the other characters like Zero and Axel. His action trigger is a button mashing game. A charges his attack power and B charges the status conditions that he can inflict on the enemy. The WE goes into the timer you have to mash the buttons. His hyper mode is Glint Armor, where he becomes a luscious golden boy, but I think all it does is increase his stats like all the other hyper modes do, but it's not the worst thing in the world since he is made to take hits and hit hard. Marino is the thief archetype in this game. She has a high speed stat and her attack does multiple hits, which is really good in certain scenarios. Her action trigger is a slots game where you must match 3 pictures to get a certain effect to happen. All of them are attacks, so you aren't going to miss out on much if you fail, but I'd rather just have a regular attack that makes more sense than a slot machine. It also gives me PTSD to Pokemon Diamond and Pearl. The WE affects how slow the wheel will spin, so it might be for the best to use it at high WE costs. Her hyper mode is called Quicksilver, and it is the best aspect about her. She becomes the fastest party member, being able to do multiple turns back to back. She has her uses, but I think she gets outdone by Zero. Cinnamon is the designated healer and is the reason why she is one of the best party members in the game. She is not the best attacker in the game, but I think it is still worth it to do attacks with her since almost all of her weapons deal debuffs to the enemy. Also, I don't know if this was me, but she was incredibly bulky and took a hit like nothing happened. Her action trigger is what makes her though. It's a spin the stick minigame where you spin the stick to increase the size of the hearts. I find this minigame to be a bit off since I sometimes get the hearts I want, it's sometimes a rotation wouldn't register. But even at low numbers, this action trigger restores a ton of health. Her hyper mode is Iron Maiden, which raises her stats and causes her to automatically block. If you build her right, she can be a tank, which is what I did. The final party member is Axel. Axel is a weird one, because he is basically a combination of X, Zero, and Spider. He can have either a one-hit pistol or dual pistols like Zero's weapons, he has an all-arounder in terms of stats like X, and he has the same hyper mode benefits like Spider. But what makes Axel tick is his action trigger. His action trigger is a set of grid inputs that you must do to reach a certain robot master that you beat. This can be really useful for wanting to deal with elemental attacks that you want to deal with, since you got Wild Django for thunder attacks, Silverhorn for water attacks, and Mach Jankra, I'm sorry if I fucked that up, for fire attacks. The WE for his action trigger affects the timer for putting in the inputs, but not the power of the attacks. If you already know the button combination you want to go down, then you can use it at low WE and be fine. Axel didn't click with me at first, but by the end of the game, I understood him. The party balancing is something I think needs to be talked about. I don't think that any of these party members are bad whatsoever, but I do believe that by chapter 7, the game wants you to use X, Zero, and Axel out of the characters, which makes sense since they basically outclass others in certain ways. But I did only play this game once, so add a pinch of salt to that. But yeah, I like the battle system in this game. It's very fun and satisfying to nail. Now, before I forget, let's go over the bosses between chapters 2 and 8, cause what kind of Mega Man game would this be without bosses? Django is the first of the Mavericks to fight in this game, and he is pretty standard for the first real boss of the game. He is thunder elemented, but since you have X-Fire, it shouldn't really be a big problem for you to deal with. I think the only thing to be worried about is that he has the ability Lightning Rod, which when hit will increase his speed, so be wary of it. Silverhorn is the boss of chapter 3. He is water elemented, so I recommend not using X-Fire in this fight, unless you know you could survive the final few turns. When he is about to be defeated, I honestly recommend using Spider and Massimo's hyper modes instead. The attacks that I would say are worried about are Cryogenics, which has the chance to freeze a party member, and his ultimate move in the second phase, Pressure Abyss, which is a hard hitting move. Dr. Psych is the boss of chapter 4, and his first phase is honestly not that bad. The main thing you really want to be worried about against him is that he summons needles and they can be annoying to deal with. But the second phase is where Sandy goes to die. Mad Nautilus is one of the hardest bosses on the first go around. His gimmick is that he has a shield on him until he delivers his most devastating attack, where between him launching an attack and him being recharged. The attack can deal a huge amount of damage since it can hit your team multiple times. What also makes this boss really hard is that he is an airborne enemy, and melee attacks have a harder time hitting airborne enemies. At least the boss is not elemented so you can use X-Fire, but I don't recommend it since X-Fire's attacks are melee focused instead of it being a range attack. The chapter 5 boss is Magenta. His whole thing is that he can summon standard enemies for backup. They aren't the biggest threat in the world. I recommend that you destroy the ones that can heal Genta. What you should be worried about is his attack Flames of Genna, which is a bit like Ultra Fire, but a lot more powerful. But also, very rarely he could drain your WE. His weakness is water, and by this point you should have Axel, so use Silverhorn on him and his backup. Also, don't use X-Fire on this boss, as attacking someone with the same element as them will heal them instead. There are 2 bosses in chapter 6. The first one is Shadow. Shadow is divided into 2 phases. The first phase is one you don't need to worry about much, but just make sure he doesn't charge up his pulverizer cannon. The second phase is the real boss fight. He has the same moves as the first phase, but in the second phase, he gained the ability to instantly kill you with a move called Codebreaker, so make sure you have backups or repairs on standby. The second boss of chapter 6 is a very interesting one named Incentus. His gimmick is that he switches between the 3 elements in the game, and whatever element he has is the element he uses to attack. He also has a ton of help, so he is a pretty tough boss to help deal with. The best way to defeat him, I would say, is to have a variety of elemental weapons on the party, as it will make it easier to deal with him. The boss in chapter 7 is the first rebellion member, Bodos. He is honestly not too bad. I would say the hardest part about him is dealing with his backups, while also dealing damage to him. He has a ton of help. His attacks aren't the biggest concern overall, it's more so that one of his attacks can lower your stats, making it harder to attack him. So I would say focus on one character to use a hyper mode to wail on him as hard as you can. The final boss to mention is Ferrum in chapter 8. Her thing is that she can use the ability to heat haze, which can make her attack twice, so it makes her moves like Bloody Snake hit really hard. Also, the more you bring down her health, the more powerful her ice attacks will be. I highly recommend using Zero in this fight. Hyper mode action trigger will do so much to her, and as always, I do not recommend X-Fire because of the ice attacks. With the gameplay side done, we turn to the other major pillar for RPGs, and that is the story. Even if the gameplay of an RPG is fun, it won't really be all that worth it if the story isn't anything to want to get further into. The same works the other way around. You want to hit that balance of satisfying gameplay in an intriguing story, which is why the worst RPGs almost always fail at birth, like Sicker Star. But sadly, I think that Command Mission falters in this category. Now, there are elements about the story that I really like, and even think they executed pretty well. Giga City as a location is a pretty interesting interesting idea for the X series, a city that is so far in the future where people are pushing the limits of what can be done with Reploids. It feels like a natural evolution to the world of the X series, since Megaman X7 gave us Axel, who was a new age Reploid. I also like the possibility that the reason Axel is in Giga City is that the Force Metals might be the reason that he might has the ability to copy other robots. Something they don't really do much in Mega Man X8. Massimo and Spider feel like the ones that we learn the most about after their designated chapters from the party members. Spider is a rogue thief. You can tell that he is up to something, but don't really think much about it like X. But it's not until chapter 6 where it comes back. But you also don't really think about it much since, he fucking dies. It gives the vibe that he is someone that is always doing something, but being vague enough to not really think too much about it. Massimo is a Reploid who followed in the footsteps of the original Steel Massimo. We first see him and we hear that Spider heard about Steel Massimo, but it's obvious that Massimo is a coward. But later in the chapter, there's a scene of Massimo talking to the original Massimo, who looks like he is on the brink of death. Massimo admits that he gained the armor to hide. The original Massimo encourages the current Massimo that he can be strong too, and tells him to keep the armor before succumbing to his injuries. After the fight against Silverhorn, Massimo confesses his past to X, but X and Spider boost Massimo's spirits and convince him to continue to help the resistance. And I think that is pretty neat. The biggest pro I have for the story in this game is that Sigma does not show up whatsoever throughout the story, and that is a major plus. I mentioned this in the setup section of the video, but it is nice to have new villains and not a character that was overused to hell and back. But this is where we get into why I think the story doesn't work overall. The new characters in this game really don't get much to do in the story overall. I like Massimo. He is probably the only new character of the four that actually had me intrigued the most. But after that, it feels like a typical Mega Man X adventure with X, Zero, and Axel, which is honestly the biggest disappointment for me in terms of the story. The only character that really leaves an impression on the player is Spider. He's mysterious, like I said, and he has one of the best moments in the game in Chapter 6, where he gives his life to save the party. It's also disappointing since the characters show up in cutscenes with X and Zero and interact with them, but we do not do much with them outside of that. But I also think that Zero's character journey is a little half-baked in this game. The journey with Zero is that he doesn't want to be with X's team since it contains people from Giga City, which to some degree I understand, since Shadow was a member of Giga City and betrayed him in X. But the problem is that we do not spend enough time on the journey since it basically ends after the first Shadow boss, leaving me feeling disappointed, which is the best word I can describe this story. It is disappointing. Now, some of the highest arguments I heard regarding this game is all about the timeline placement regarding it, because the time period of Command Mission takes place around the same period as the Mega Man Zero series. But honestly, even before I played the game, I always thought it took place in an alternate timeline away from the Mega Man Zero games. A timeline where Sigma is defeated and the world was recovered and on the path of robotic evolution. Not much really to get into a fight about, but I digress. The story section wasn't really all that long, but that's because there's not really much to the story overall. Like, all the cool stuff that I mentioned is all in the setup and in the endgame. And speaking of which, we're about to hit the endgame. Now, there are things to do in Command Mission. The first one is the Deployment Center. During your time in dungeons, you will come across robots that are damaged. You can take them in and send them on deployments that net you items, money, and chips. It's not really the most in-depth system when it comes to side content. It's basically there to get some extra things that you are out doing the story. But this can lead to getting extra stuff that can help you in the long run. The problem I had with that is I did it later than what you normally do. So I may have remembered it by chapter 7, which is basically where you're reaching the end game of the story. When you are traveling to the shops in the hub world, you will come across a gacha machine. Throughout dungeons, you will come across the items called figure tokens. You use them on the gacha machines to get figures of the characters and enemies in the game. That's really the only thing that this thing does, which is something, I guess. The last thing to mention in terms of extras is the Sky Room. It's a room that contains all the other extras in the game. The best comparison I can think of for this area is Professor Pickle's room from Sonic Unleashed. Man, if I had a nickel for every time I mentioned Sonic Unleashed in this video, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that happened twice, right? Here you can see all the figures you got, cutscenes and music you unlock from the Deployment Center, and a little bit of customization regarding X's overworld look. You can change the color of his scarf. You can unlock more colors by reaching requirements that are met within the game, like finding a certain number of enemies, getting it from the Deployment Center, and getting all the sketches in the game. But it's honestly something I don't really care much about. I already think X looks pretty cool with the red scarf on, so changing the color of the scarf didn't really excite me. Anyway, with all that out of the way, we can get into the finale of the game. After the events of Chapter 8, X and the gang see the third member of the Rebellion Army known as Scarface. He shows up wanting to battle you. Scarface as a boss is actually a really simple one. He has electric type and will counter based on certain attacks, but it's something that I am not all that well versed in mechanically. But I beat him on my first go, so it shouldn't be all that hard. Scarface then talks about being a maverick and what he believes in. It's moments like these that make you really think about what mavericks have always been in the X series, one of my favorite moments in the game. Nana then says that she was able to track Scarface's transmission and found the location of the Rebellion Army at the Grave Ruins base. For the last dungeon in the game, this was honestly a little lackluster and underwhelming. The most this dungeon does is that there are sensors in the hallways on each floor, and to go to another room, you have to trip the sensors and battle the enemies or run away from them. But other than that, it's pretty standard for what to expect from the dungeons in this game. You reach the top of the base, and you find a leader of the Rebellion Army there, Epsilon. But before you fight Epsilon, Scarface takes X's shot for Epsilon and says that he wants to fight X one last time. Just like with his fight at the in-between point of chapters 8 and 9, he is an overall very simple fight. Scarface as a character feels very lacking and probably the one aspect of the story that I am the most disappointed about, since that Maverick talk was well done and could have been more. He has some interesting ideas for him, being a rival to X throughout the game and then realizing X's strength after battling him many times. But 'twas not to be.
Glory to the rebellion! I can see you are determined. But Scarface, I will not run from this fight, for I know that this bridge must be crossed to achieve our ideal. They will tremble before the power of Epsilon! Kneel before the mighty Epsilon!
Now it is the time for the battle against Epsilon. Epsilon's fight to me feels like the first phase of a final boss. With the sky backdrop and the way he looks with his cloak on, it reminds me of Sigma from Megaman X6, where he was zombie-like with how he looked and the way he moved. I also like that this isn't out of nowhere and is implied at the beginning of the game in the first chapter. Epsilon was a boss that also felt like a final boss in terms of his battle. The main thing that he does is that he will grab you and do an attack that will always take you down to 1 health point. But this is also a double-edged sword since you can do the attack to someone with 1 health and it won't kill him. But I would still recommend healing your team if they are 1 health bar, since his attacks are pretty rough. He's also a two-phase fight, so be aware of that going in. After the boss, X blows Epsilon away and the mission is complete. Red shows up out of nowhere and secures the Super Force medal from X and tells the Maverick Hunters that a ship has been scheduled to pick them all up. X and the gang are on the helipad where the ship comes, but once you think that it was over,
What? Huh?
Red was on the Rebellion Army's motives the entire time and wanted to take the Super Force medal from himself. He declares X and his team traitors and he destroys their base of operations. X and the gang escape and make their way through the HQ where Red is. The HQ as a final area is basically in this game not only to hide the true final boss of the game, but to also hold the one thing in every Mega Man game that I just wish they would get rid of at this point, the boss rush. But I will say that the boss rush in this game is not the worst one in the series apparently. The bosses are beefed up to meet your level and they don't explode as long as the 2D platformers in the series. There are only 4 bosses to fight instead of 8 and there is a new boss waiting for you at the end of the section that gives you a new copy ability for Axel. You can also refill your sub tanks and health after every boss you face. But I am still not the biggest fan of boss rushes overall, sorry not sorry. After all of that, you reach the top of HQ and catch up with Redups. Redups as a boss is honestly quite a difficult one. The main thing he does is that he summons 2 Mavericks that can deal damage. When he doesn't summon them, he blocks or attacks you, and his attacks can inflict crash on a party member, which is an instant kill move. The way you go about this boss is to attack his support, then attack him when he summons more. It was a hard fight, but I was able to defeat him. After the fight, we get the biggest reveal in the game.
Last! What were we fighting for?
For everything, my maverick hunters. For your new ruler.
No! We lost R and Spider for this lousy creep?
Ah, Spider.
What? This can't be real!
My ears are burning. You talking about me?
Redups was Spider the entire time. I guess if I was younger playing this game, I would have never seen it coming, but being an adult playing it for the first time, I thought it was pretty predictable. Spider, from the moment that you met him in Chapter 2, said that he had his own goals in mind. You never speak to Redups in person throughout the game until Chapter 9. Whenever you do contact him, Spider is never there with you, and somehow just comes back after the communication is off. Redups is always telling the player what to do next instead of Chief R telling you what to do, and Redups is Spidered, spelled backwards! I don't want people to think that I want Mega Man stories to be like super in depth and have the deepest mysteries in the world like it's fucking Succession or Andor, but I think that it was a little too obvious in this case, but I do respect what they were going through though. Redups escapes through a transporter, which you follow him. Redups fuses himself with the 2 Super Force Metals, turning him into a giant god monster as all JRPG final bosses do.
I shall rule over all, for I am invincible.
The first phase of this fight, you can't really do much to him. He has 2 force metals strapped to his shoulders that can deal damage to him, recover him, and put a shield on him. But after a bit, Ferrum shows up out of nowhere and pulls one of the force metals off, and the true final battle begins.
Now's our chance! Redups!
Meddling insects! Mortals! Behold my almighty power!
Redups is a pretty straightforward boss if I'm being honest. He has the force metal on his left shoulder that could give him the shield and can deal elemental damage. Redups gets a new move in this place where he sends you in a black hole which bombards you with almost every status helmet in the game. But other than that, he's not the hardest boss in the game. I honestly think Redups in the HQ was harder.
Impossible! Absolutely impossible!
After the battle, Redups is a dead man, and Ferrum decides to drift out into space with the Super Force Metal, leaving nothing behind but a fireball heading back to Earth with X on it. The gang find an emergency hatch and jump into it. Back on Earth, they leave the hatch and find that they are in the middle of nowhere, ending Mega Man X Command Mission. So overall, what did I think of Mega Man X Command Mission? Well, there are things I actually like about this game. I do get the feeling that it was somewhat rushed during the process of making it. The combat in this game is pretty darn good and makes perfect sense for the X series. The soundtrack is pretty good, with atmosphere and not missing out on the high beat music that the X series is well known for. The story has some interesting implications for the world of the X series, and the voice acting is not as bad as I thought it was going to be. But the parts that feel somewhat rushed in this game, like the lackluster dungeon design that makes going through them not all that fun, the stilted line deliveries and animation, coupled with somewhat bland face medals that stay the same during moments that should be impactful, don't hit as hard, and the fact that the game doesn't really do much with the new characters like Cinnamon, Massimo, and Marion after the introduction chapters really tell me that this game was rushed. I do think that this is a game worth trying out though. Who knows, maybe you'll like it more than me. Hell, I have a friend who likes the game and that's okay with him, his opinion. But to me, it's quite sad to think about this game because it's not as widely available to the public along with the other Mega Man X spin-offs. I talked about this on the channel. I guess you could still buy Maverick Hunter X on the PS Store on the Vita, but aside from that, you can't buy the Extreme Duology on the 3DS anymore because the eShop is closed, and Command Mission has never been re-released to my knowledge. A world where we got a X Legacy Collection 3 with the spin-offs would be an interesting world to live in, since I do think that spin-off titles deserve to be remembered and preserved. But I think that would do it for this video. I hope you all enjoyed it. Next time we talk about Mega Man, we're going to talk about the sequel to Mega Man X7, Mega Man X8. Let me know what you think of Command Mission, and as always, have a nice day.